I ended my lecture on realism with this Daumier lithograph. By the way, did you catch that limestone, and also sometimes aluminum, but that came later, is the surface used to create lithographs? You'll need to know that. Now, as we move into photography, I want to take up the question that Daumier raised and in some ways mocked in this caricature. Was photography truly an art? Did it threaten to replace traditional art? Since the Italian Renaissance, painters had struggled to create an illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane. They employed perspective, chiaroscuro, subtle modulations of color, and by the High Baroque, they pretty much had this down. And then along came photography, which could accomplish many of the same feats using light, chemicals, and one of the Industrial Revolution's infernal machines. Nature could be reproduced close to perfectly. So did this bring art closer to nature and therefore create a truer art? This painter says yes. So when I found that quotation, I got curious and I looked up the painter's work. Roche was a very successful Academy painter who specialized in large-scale history paintings. Here's an example. Note how carefully he has tried to capture the cloth realistically, but not any more realistically, I would argue, than Van Eyck accomplished in the 1400s. And now we hear from our friend, the Romantic painter Delacroix. In this quote, at least, Delacroix claims to find photography false for a rather odd and interesting reason. He thinks a photograph puts in everything without making choices, and that keeps it from being art. By the way, a realist painter such as Courbet would probably embrace this aspect of photography. Remember that in the Stonebreakers, Courbet deliberately avoided creating a focal point. Every detail mattered, and no detail seemed to matter more than any others. Delacroix, note, disagreed. And yet, Delacroix was actually one of the first painters to embrace photography as an artist's tool. He formed a collaborative partnership with a photographer, Eugène Durieux. Delacroix posed the models, Durieux photographed the models, and then Delacroix sketched the models. Here's one example. And here's another Delacroix stage photograph. Note the dramatic lighting and the carefully draped cloth. And by the way, who is Delacroix channeling here? It's hard to miss the similarity to our Odalisque. The painting on the left is also by Ingres. The guy was really into backs. And here's a famous photo of Delacroix by our buddy Nadar next to a Delacroix self-portrait. What do you think? Which offers more insight into the painter? And now, alas, I need to get a little technical. We've already talked about the camera obscura and how artists, including probably Vermeer, used it to help them capture reality in paintings. Around the year 1800, Thomas Wedgwood made the first known attempt to capture the image in a camera obscura by means of a light-sensitive substance, in other words, to make the image permanent. He used paper or white leather treated with silver nitrate. The images produced with this device were faint, and they did not last. It was Louis de Guerre, pictured on the right, who overcame some of these problems and figured out a technique for fixing an image permanently onto a silver surface plate. It was a very complicated and time-consuming process, as this video clip from the Getty Museum will demonstrate. I really don't think you need to know all of these details, but I want you to have a sense of its complexity. You probably do need to know that the process required very long exposure times and that it produced only one non-reproducible image. In other words, there were no negatives, much less Google Photos libraries. I'm cutting this off before the description of how the photos were developed, but if you have time, the last 2 minutes of this video are also very interesting. It's easy to see from this still life, one of our required works, why artists such as Roche and Delacroix proclaimed the products of this new technology as art. Actually, I should have said Roche. Delacroix was more dubious. Many art photographers still like to work in black and white because of the extraordinary play of light and shadow and the three-dimensional illusionistic modeling that black and white photos can create. So what was another huge advantage of a still life? These objects didn't have to stand still or sit still through the long exposure time. They were blessedly inanimate. As you learn from the reading, I hope, Guerre also included symbolism related to light in the sun. Putti, those rather dopey little angels, were associated with Phaeton, son of Helios, the Greek god, and the ram's head is a reference to the golden fleece, descended also from the sun god Helios. Note, too, the very deliberate similarity to a Dutch Baroque Vanitas painting. Guerre's still life is clearly an attempt to show photography as art. He did not set out to capture a moment in time or a particular expression. This tradition lives on in art photography, but it didn't take full advantage of photography's potential to capture real life. On with our technology story. After reading early reports of Guerre's invention, William Henry Fox Talbot succeeded in creating stabilized photographic negatives on paper in 1835. So, why would negatives be important? They could be used to produce multiple copies, right? Nadar used the Webb collodion process, which meant he had to develop his photos up in that balloon. No wonder his hat blew off. According to Wikipedia, Nadar experienced problems caused by the chemical action on the plates of gas escaping from the balloon. And here's his self-portrait, also made using this process, which is explained in the first minute of this video. And here are a few more Nadar portraits, including a second and much more impish self-portrait. Journalists, not surprisingly, leapt at photography's ability to capture breaking news. The war in Crimea was the first war to be recorded photographically. Suddenly, a faraway war's bloody battlefield moved into people's homes. This famous photo shows an early operation performed under ether. Note the blurred figures. It betrays that there was some motion during exposure. And note the vantage point from the gallery above. This aerial view flattens the spatial perspective in a way that would intrigue impressionists, who also love the same feature in Japanese woodblock prints. Stay tuned. While some photographs were taken in Crimea, it was the American Civil War that was the first war to be quite thoroughly documented on film. This photo by Timothy O'Sullivan is the most reproduced photograph of the Civil War. It used to be a College Board favorite, but it's fallen off the list. I do love the story behind this photo, which is a required work. Leland Stanford, railroad magnate and the former governor of California, founder, of course, of Stanford University, argued that at some point in a gallop, all four of a horse's feet left the ground. Urban legend has it that he wagered $25,000 on the proposition. That was serious money in 1878. But most historians, alas, think that this is just an embellishment to the story. Anyway, Stanford enlisted the help of a scientist and photographer, Edward Muybridge. Muybridge set up 12 cameras attached to wires, which tripped when a horse crossed them. Here's the result, which proves Stanford's point and helped usher in a 20th century art form, cinema. As your homework reading noted, Muybridge's photos proved Stanford right, but they also proved earlier painters wrong. At the point where the horse's hooves actually leave the ground, they are curved rather awkwardly under the horse's bellies. Here's another set of Muybridge photos on the same theme of bodies in motion. While Muybridge had the greatest impact on cinema, painters also tried to capture some of these scenes of repeated movement. None of the following works is still on the list, and they're all from a later period, but I want you to see them in the context of Muybridge's work. This one's quite famous, and also, I think, rather goofy. Bala was a futurist. I'll have more to say about this Italian artistic movement in Unit 12. And here's another futurist, Severini. I've shown you this before. Armored Train, a real favorite of mine, is a genuinely creepy painting. I guess that says something about me. Severini deeply admired war and war machines. But for now, I just want you to note his effort to capture movement over space and time. The futurists, not surprisingly, loved Muybridge's work. This famous painting, stay tuned for Cubism, may actually have been based in part on another Muybridge study, this time an early movie. If you Google the name of this painting and then go to Wikipedia, you can see the actual film footage of a nude woman descending a staircase. I'm not going to show it in class. Nude women will feature prominently in my final lecture of the unit, however. We turn to the paintings of